Hello guys, welcome back to the Eat Like Ruby podcast. I'm back today doing an episode in our fat loss phase series, but we are getting quite close to wrapping up this series, which is really cool. So if you followed along for the whole series, that is awesome. You'll know obviously we've navigated a lot of things and we're starting to talk about coming out of the fat loss phase, which is really cool. Next week, we're going to actually really talk about how to come out of the fat loss phase and a few different things you want to think about there. Obviously, if you've just stumbled across the podcast, welcome. We have done about 2 months worth of fat loss episodes. So if that interests you, I definitely go back and have a listen to those. But what I'm going to talk about today is reasons why your fat loss phase might not have worked. And I want to make this very clear. This is not reasons why your deficit might not have worked. We talked about this literally, I think, in about the 3rd episode in this series. If we did not achieve fat loss, it was not a calorie deficit. If we are not achieving fat loss or we did not achieve fat loss, we were not in a calorie deficit by scientific definition. So if you don't understand that, you definitely want to go back and listen to all these episodes. And even if you heard that back at the start and then you've navigated through your fat loss phase and now you're kind of sitting here in a whatever position you're in, you might have started to think that like, oh, my deficit didn't work. Again, let's intercept. Let's clear that up right now. If we did not achieve fat loss, we were not in a deficit. So that's not what I'm talking about today. We are talking today about things that might have stopped your fat loss phase from being successful. And that's going to make more sense as we get into it. But it's more so about, I guess we would say, habits, maybe lifestyle, mindset things, just a few things that we want to think about. If you went into the last few weeks and months with the intention of having a successful fat loss phase and that hasn't worked out how you planned, you might have a very clear reason and understanding why. Like you might be able to say, yeah, this is why it hasn't worked. But if you're kind of like, oh, what's going on here? I think what we're going to look at today is probably going to relate most to people who feel like, why can't I get this right? Why isn't this working for me? Kind of energy. So if you're feeling like a little bit lost around that, we're going to clear up some of the most common things I see today that we want to make sure we understand and we're across if we're in this position of being like, I've been trying to implement my fat loss phase and it's just not clicking. And as a little bit of a side note, if you have implemented a successful fat loss phase, first of all, I'm clapping. Well done. That's awesome. Like I said, next week, we're going to start looking at moving away from fat loss, moving to maintenance, moving away from tracking food, what that looks like, when we do that, how we do that, etc. There's a lot to look at there and it's going to be very dependent on your individual circumstances and I'll get more into that next week. But if you're hearing this episode thinking like, oh, but I have achieved successful fat loss, where do I go from here? I got you. Those episodes are coming early next week. But if we get into today's episode of why your fat loss phase might not have worked or might not be working, like I said, obviously there can be a lot going on here, but there's a few common things that I want to look at. The very first thing I'd be looking at, the first thing I'd be asking if you're in this position is, did I actually implement a flexible, enjoyable approach to my nutrition? First of all, do I understand how to do that? And secondly, did I do it? And there's sort of those two little parts to look at here. That first one being like, do I understand that? So if you've just stumbled across the podcast or you're listening to them in like a random order and you don't really truly understand that you can include literally any and all foods in your diet and work towards your fat loss goals, that is your first thing that you want to understand and get your head around. You want to understand exactly how fat loss is achieved. So that's probably the first thing I'd be asking is, do I actually definitely understand the actual process of how fat loss is achieved? Because I think when we ask that question of like, do you understand how to lose weight or do you understand fat loss? People can be like, yeah, you need to eat healthy, you need to eat good, you need to eat well. We've spoken about that so much on the podcast. There's a very big difference between, quote, eating good and eating in the right way for you to personally achieve fat loss. So make sure you really understand that and ask that question. Do I actually definitely know how fat loss is achieved? And if you do, then you know that we can literally include any and all foods in our days of eating to work towards a fat loss goal. So then I'd be asking like, secondly, do I understand that? And then thirdly, I guess, do I actually implement that? So if we're looking at someone who's been struggling to achieve fat loss, there's a few more like in-depth things that we are going to get into in a second. But I think the first thing we just want to ask is like, do I actually understand this? And do I have a flexible, enjoyable approach in place to work towards it? Because sometimes people can feel like they're really lost and they're spinning their wheels and they're not sure what they're doing. And then we teach them flexible dieting and we're like, hey, did you know, like, you just have to understand your energy intake and you can work in any food you enjoy into that intake. People learn that. They're like, oh my God, I thought I had been terrible at this thing for my whole life and I just didn't know how to do it in an enjoyable way. So that is the first thing that I always want people to think about, because that's essentially like the most simple and the most effective. If we can get our heads around that, and that is enough for us personally to then have success with a fat loss phase that we haven't had success with before, that's awesome. So I'd be asking if you really understand that. And then the last little thing before we move on to the next point is asking, do I truly implement that? Because I think it can be common for people to kind of hear about flexible dieting and hear the fact that they can include their favorite foods in their diet and work towards fat loss. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's cool, that's awesome, and I'm kind of dabbling in it. But then if you've also spent a really long time like restricting foods and cutting out certain foods, etc., you can still have some of those beliefs happening as well. So you can literally almost be in like two minds where you're like, oh yeah, flexible dieting, that's cool, but like I shouldn't eat too much carbs. I shouldn't eat too much bread. I shouldn't eat too much pasta. So I think it's just important to clock where you're at with that. Are you like kind of adopting the flexible dieting approach, but then kind of running back to old habits as well? And then if we look at what's required to achieve fat loss, obviously we know we need an effective calorie deficit in place, but we also know we need consistency to our approach and the effective deficit. So what I'm getting at there is, if because you're in two minds, you're kind of running back and forth between different approaches, you probably don't have consistency. So I would just intercept that and go like, do I understand flexible, enjoyable dieting? If I don't, that's the first thing I want to get my head around. Because if, like I said, often we can get our head around that and it's like, oh my God, this is awesome. I never knew about this. Happy days, I'm sorted. Then if we do understand that, we just want to ask like, am I actually implementing it in a flexible, enjoyable way for myself? Or am I running back to old habits at times as well? So in summary of the first point, that's what I'd be looking at straight away is, do I have that flexible, enjoyable approach in place? If I don't, I'd start there. If you do, if you're like, yep, no, I get that, that's awesome, I've got a flexible diet, happy days, but something still hasn't clicked for me. Maybe it's just this time, or maybe it's in general. And like in general, and you've got a history of it not clicking, right? We're going to look at a few reasons that could be going on right now. One of the first, I guess, like this is kind of the second thing I'd look at. If you've ticked off the flexible dieting thing, the second thing I would look at is there just something happening in my life where like probably external of my nutrition and training that is quite full on, quite demanding, maybe quite unexpected, and it's requiring a lot of my energy, a lot of my attention, etc. And it just makes sense that I can't give the energy and effort to my nutrition training like I was intending to. And this could be something really awesome. Like we can see this when people get promotions or like something really cool happens in their life and they're like, oh my God, this things come up. It's now like my main focus, my main priority for a while. And then, like I said, nutrition and training just can't get the energy and attention that they normally would, or that we would just be wanting to give them. So it can be a positive thing, or this can be when something quite negative and quite unexpected and intense happens. Like, I've used this example on the podcast before, but I think it's just a great example to bring up to help people understand and take the pressure off themselves. When my dad passed away, the literal last thing I was doing the next day was counting calories, right? And this probably sounds like I think it's one of those things where when you heard me say that, you'd be like, well, yeah, no shit, we wouldn't expect you to count calories at that time, Rubes. But then I think we need to make sure we have that same approach for ourselves, because I think people can find themselves in these situations, whether you have lost someone, or maybe someone's really sick, maybe you've got a child that's sick, a parent that's sick, someone's in the hospital, anything in that same area or in that same kind of intensity that is very intense, it is very hectic, it's very full on. I think we need to meet ourselves with a bit of grace and a bit of compassion and go, okay, there's this crazy thing happening in my life. It makes sense that I can't follow a diet or count calories or whatever we're doing. I think the main sort of point here is just understanding that there are big things that can happen in life where we actually just need to acknowledge those and go, I need to take the pressure off myself right now. And there's a bit of duality in this, because if we take this approach all the time to any little thing that happens, we can find ourselves just being like, oh, I got stuck at work and I couldn't stick to my diet. Oh, this happened. Oh, someone got sick for one day. Oh, something little happened and I couldn't stick to my diet. We want to be able to differentiate between these things. If you are getting derailed anytime a little thing happens, we want to look at that. And I'm going to talk about that more. I think I'm going to talk about that more in some upcoming episodes very soon. But what I'm talking about here is something big, very intense, very demanding that, like I said, if someone else was going through that thing, you wouldn't expect them to be able to give a lot of energy and effort to their nutrition protocols, right? And I've used this example on the podcast before, but when my dad passed away very unexpectedly, and literally my whole family, like everyone just dropped everything for this because it was obviously very unexpected, very intense. And what I'm getting at is at that time, literally it was so close to Christmas, and it was one of those things where you had so many boxes of chocolates around for Christmas, but then people started bringing like chocolates and lasagna and different things to the house because, you know, when someone dies, people like to bake for you and do things like that. And it's lovely. But what I'm getting at is for a 2-week period, I literally think my diet was like chocolates from boxes of chocolates, lasagna that like the neighbor had cooked. One of the neighbors made this date loaf and my sister and I had about 8 pieces of this every single day. So not that I'm encouraging people to eat this way, but what I'm getting at is, like I said, when I woke up in those initial days after my dad passed away, I was not thinking like, how much protein have I had today? What is my calorie count for today, etc. You just don't even have the energy at all to put thought into that, let alone actually put effort into it. So like I said, I was like, whatever's here, I'm just going to eat to keep myself alive. Yep, date loaf, happy days, right? So like I said, I'm not encouraging that. That's obviously like a bit of a random example, but it's just something that we want to think about. If you're in a position right now where you're like, wanted to achieve fat loss, and I'm kind of beating myself up a little bit because I haven't been able to stick to it, etc., just clock as well, has something very unexpected and very big happened that makes sense that I then couldn't bring the energy and effort I wanted to my nutrition. And like I said, it can be negative and intense, like I just used my example, but we can also just see this with positive things. If people get a promotion or they move house, you know, sometimes people have had their house on the market for ages and then randomly it sells and like, shit, I need to move in a couple of weeks. And that's just like demanding. It's intense. It's time consuming. It's energy consuming, it's thought consuming, like you're just putting everything into this thing. And then by default, you just don't have as much to put into your nutrition and or training that you usually would or that you were hoping or planning that you would be able to during this time. So that's the second thing I would be asking. Is there actually something quite clear and quite obvious that has happened and pulled my focus? And if there has, I think you just have to acknowledge that. I think acknowledgement is the biggest thing here because I think a lot of people don't kind of step back, take a bird's eye view and acknowledge it and go, yeah, shit, it actually makes sense that I haven't then been able to implement my fat loss phase the way I planned. And I think there can be a lot of like beating yourself up or even just like, why can't I get my shit together kind of energy. And if we step back and we look at it, it's like, oh my God, it's so obvious why I can't get my shit together. Like I've got my shit together for this other thing. So that's just something I would have a look at. And you just want to meet yourself with a little bit of compassion and a little bit of grace and go, hang on a minute, this actually makes a lot of sense. So while it might not be ideal, like if you wanted to achieve fat loss at this time and then something external has happened and derailed that, yes, it's not ideal and we can acknowledge that, but it's also potentially not your fault or not a fault of yours. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and go, hang on a minute, am I beating myself up about not being able to do this thing when it actually makes a lot of sense that I haven't been able to do it right now? And I don't want to get too off topic and start to get into a lot of advice and everything, but my little bit of advice I would give in that scenario is to just give yourself a bit of a break, scale back to the bare minimum. I don't want to encourage people to eat the way I just said I was eating when my dad passed away, but scale back to the bare minimum depending on the severity of the thing that you're going through and what that looks like. It might just mean that you move back to maintenance and you implement the deficit at another time. You might just have to try and survive and get through a few weeks and you don't care about maintenance or deficits or anything. Or you might just be able to implement a couple of habits. You might go, you know what, I can't really think much about nutrition, but I'm going to walk every day. Maybe I can't think much about calories, but I'm going to be mindful of protein. And I think that's so dependent on, like I said, the severity of your situation. I don't want to be telling people like, oh, someone just passed away, make sure you get enough protein. But if it's like a little thing that you're dealing with right now, maybe you can give some energy to protein or veggies or steps or anything at all. So I think that'll make a lot more sense if you've listened to all of the fat loss episodes. So if you haven't, go back and do so. But really just have a think like, what can I control? What can't I control? And just making sure we give ourselves a bit of compassion and a bit of love as we navigate that, instead of beating ourselves up for the things that we can't do right now, if it actually makes sense that we can't really do them. And then if we move on to like the third category, I guess you'd call it, this is something that we have referenced throughout this fat loss series, but I think it's something that when people first hear it, they're like, no, that's not me. And then we touch on it again a few weeks later to see if maybe it is you. And you might still be like, no, that's not me. And then we touch on it again. And we're going to touch on it again right now to bring awareness and maybe clock the fact if this is you. What I am talking about here is if you're in a position where you're like, I wanted to pursue fat loss, it hasn't worked out for me. If we think about the last two categories that I just listed, you're like, no, that's not really me. I understand flexible dieting. Nothing major has happened that should have derailed me too hugely. We come to this third one. Are you just so friggin' diet fatigued? I'm pausing for effect. Are you just so friggin' fatigued from dieting? We literally call this diet fatigue. And what we are talking about here is a little bit like the physical accumulation of being tired from dieting. So like low energy, hunger, like the physical things that we can feel from being on a diet for a long time, but more so the mental drain of trying to stick to a diet, and usually like a restrictive and or low calorie diet, for a long time. And like I said, we touched on this at so many points throughout the fat loss series, because when we're starting a fat loss phase, this is one of the first things we say to people is like, have you actually been doing this for ages? Is it the right time for you to keep doing it or do it again and go after it again? Are you actually pretty friggin' tired from already having done it for a really long time? And this is when we initially see most people go, no, I'm sweet. Let's go. Fat loss phase, come at me. And then what we tend to see here is that we start the fat loss phase, we go into our calorie deficit, we can maybe stick to it for a few days, maybe even a few weeks or a week. And then this is where we so commonly see the little snacks come in, or the little extras, or I might have a maintenance day, I might have a maintenance weekend, I might have a maintenance week. No shit, that's right, I have a fat loss goal, I'm going back to my fat loss phase. Hang on a minute, I'm snacking again. I'm going back to my low calories. Maybe I should take my calories up a little bit. No shit, that's right, I've got a fat loss goal. Bring them down again. Maintenance day again, maintenance weekend. This is one of the biggest signs of diet fatigue, is that you know what your deficit is, you know what your calories should be, you know what it should all look like. Like when you step back, it's almost like logically I get it, emotionally I can't stick to it. And there's kind of two ways that this whole like emotionally I can't stick to it thing can be a factor. And I'm going to talk about the second one in a minute. That's like my fourth point, but that's a little bit more extreme. I'll get to that in a second. But what I'm looking at here is if you're like, yeah, I understand flexible dieting. I understand the deficit. Like I said, nothing major's happened in my life. I should be able to do this thing. But for whatever reason, I'm just having the little snacks. I'm spooning shit out of the jar. Like I said, I'm going to maintenance way too often. And this is where I always say there's no right or wrong. I teach people how to have maintenance days. I teach people how to go to maintenance. That can be such a positive thing, right? That's a great skill to have, and it can be such a positive thing. But if we're looking at someone who's got this diet fatigue thing playing out, where it's like, I want to stick to my deficit, yet I'm continuously dabbling in all of these other little things that conflict with the deficit or stop the deficit or pull me out of it. And if we bring it back to the diet fatigue, what we tend to see going on here is you've just been doing it for too long. And so sticking to the low calories with a flexible diet, that's great. Like we can still include foods in moderation and we can still make it enjoyable, etc. But there is still an element of restriction. If you're on low calories and you're planning days and you're ticking boxes and you're trying to make everything work, and you then are obviously going through little bouts of hunger and possibly cravings and energy dips and things like that, there's still an element there of restriction in place, and it can be positive restriction. But we know that we need to restrict the energy intake in order to elicit fat loss, right? Even if that's done in a positive way, even if that's done in an enjoyable way, having restriction in place for a long enough time, whether it's positive and enjoyable or not, is still going to take a toll on somebody. And that is really what diet fatigue is. It's just like, this diet has taken a toll on me for too long. And if you can relate to a lot of the shit I just said, where you're constantly kind of bouncing in and out of it, I would really be looking at, do I think I'm just tired AF from dieting? And more so like, yes, you might be physically tired, but I'm more so mean like mentally tired. And this, I mean, I could take this into a whole nother convo, and we kind of are going to touch on this next week when we talk about going to maintenance and stuff. And we've kind of touched on this before, but if I just try and keep it short here, if you're in this position, and usually this is happening, not always, but usually commonly this can happen when there's not a big fat loss goal. So a person in that position, maybe you have achieved good fat loss and you're sort of down getting those last couple of kilos off, and you're just bouncing back and forth for friggin' ages. And what I would say here as like a bit of a blanket statement, but a big red flag that you could be suffering diet fatigue is if you've been trying to lose the same 2 to 5 kilos for longer than 6 months. If you have been trying to lose the same 2 to 5 kilos, give or take, but that small fat loss goal for longer than 6 months, especially if you know how fat loss is achieved. And we see this a lot with people that would consider themselves advanced, experienced, like, I'm a gym gal, I'm a flexible dieter, I get this, I get it, right? Yes, you get the nutrition science and you understand the deficit and you understand fat loss and you understand flexible dieting. That's awesome. Do you understand the fact that you are spinning your wheels in diet fatigue? You have had a low calorie diet in place, and think about so many of the quotes I've dropped on the podcast before. If you do not have a large fat loss goal, you should not spend a large amount of time pursuing fat loss. I've said that so many times, and literally this right here, this is why. If you have been spending most of this year trying to get off those couple of kilos, why? Especially if you understand fat loss, what is going on there, right? And you might be able to relate to our next point. Like I said, I'm going to talk about that in a second. It's a little bit deeper, but I would be looking first of all at like, have I been trying to implement my deficit for this whole year? If we look at the year right now, we're 9 months into it. If you've spent 9 months on low calories to try and lose 4 kilos, give or take, that doesn't make sense. You have to ask yourself, why is it not working? And usually it's because what I said at the start of this category, it's those little snacks, it's those little spoonfuls, it's the bounce back and forth, it's all those things. And usually those things are happening because we've been on the low calories for too long. And if we really piece together what's going on here, if you're aiming for your deficit intake, but then you're having all these little extras and you're chucking in the maintenance days and you're doing this and you're doing that, maybe you're doing some of those things, maybe you're doing all of those things. But if you're aiming for a deficit and then you're doing all these little extras pretty regularly on top of it, you're most likely eating at your maintenance intake. If we think about the fact, like, let's just use some really clear numbers. For example, let's say your deficit is 1,600 calories, your maintenance is 2,000. If you're aiming for your 1,600 calories, but then you're having little snacks and spoonfuls of Nutella and peanut butter and bites of little things, so much so that you're actually consuming 1,900, 2,000, maybe 2,200, whatever it is, most days, this is why you've spent 9 months trying to lose those same couple of kilos, because you've been aiming for these low calories, you're struggling to stick to them. What you're actually consuming is your maintenance intake. So therefore you're maintaining. And what's happening here is your mindset is constantly in deficit mode. You're planning days in deficit mode. You're psyching yourself up for deficit mode. You're probably saying no to certain meals, to certain occasions, maybe to certain things. I can't eat that. That doesn't work with my calories. That doesn't work with my deficit, etc. So doing all of that is the restriction. Like I said before, that can be positive, that can be enjoyable. Like, restriction's not always bad, but if you've been implementing restriction for a really long time, that's where your diet fatigue is kicking in. But you're not getting the physical benefit that comes with that, or the result that comes with that, because you're so fatigued that all the little things are coming in, pulling you back up to maintenance, but your mindset and your mental state is still in deficit mode. And that's where the fatigue happens. Your brain and your mind and all of those things are sick of being on a restrictive diet. right? So you're exhausted AF from that, but you're not getting the result. And this is the worst position to be in. And this is why, like I said, I bring this up at the start of the fat loss phase, and then we touch on it again a few weeks later and a few weeks later and a few weeks later, because people often dig in their heels and go, no, I'm good. I can stick to my deficit. If you're hearing everything I'm saying right now and you're like, yeah, shit, that's me. I've been trying to lose those same few kilos for a really long time. Are you in this position? Has your mental state been in diet mode for a really long time, but your physical habits are not in diet mode? Because like I said, this is the worst position to be in because we're exhausted for nothing. I'm pausing for effect again because I want people to really stop and think. And this is one of those things where if you know this is not you, like you're probably like having a little bit of a laugh, sassy Rube, she's fired up, she's going off. If this is not you, it's probably just going to sound like sassy Rubes. It's not going to hit you in the feels. If this is potentially hitting you in the feels, that's where you want to stop and go, yeah, shit, is this me? And this is going to be different from person to person. And like I said before, I don't want to get too much into the advice in this episode. It will be here all day. But if you're in this position, it is well worth really, first of all, acknowledging it and going, yeah, shit, that is me. I've been spinning my wheels, trying to implement a restrictive diet for a really long time and not getting the one payoff. The single only payoff to a restrictive diet is fat loss. If you're not getting the fat loss, you got to stop and go, I'm not getting anything out of this, right? And if you're maintaining, this is where I so often encourage people in this position to actually intentionally go to maintenance for a while because the physical result is the same. You're already maintaining, right? So the physical result is the same, but you get to pull your mindset and your mental state out of the restrictive diet. And then you get to remove that diet fatigue. You get to let those things calm down. They start to feel a lot more relaxed. They start to feel a lot more positive. It's just a lot more chill. You remove yourself from this heightened spinning my wheels, trying state. You step away from that and you go, actually, no, hang on. I'm just giving myself a break. I'm taking that pressure off for a second. Therefore, like I said, I can remove that diet fatigue. And then once that's all calmed down, and side note, I would give this a few months. Most people don't want to hear that, but I would be giving this a few months. Then you can actually implement a deficit again at a later date, not in a fatigued state. If you go into a deficit already tired from that deficit, how well do you think that's going to go? And this is where we see people digging their heels and go, no, I definitely want to stick to my deficit. I've seen this every single day of my 15-year career. No, I'm good. I can do it. 2 weeks later, 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, whenever they decide to actually admit it, yeah, shit, you were right, Rubes. I probably should have gone to maintenance because I've maintained this whole time anyway. Yet I've maintained in a shitty mindset, feeling restricted, feeling shitty, feeling like I'm failing. And that's the last thing I'll say on this one. If you are right now, if you want to be achieving fat loss, but you're maintaining because of all the shit we just said, you are failing your way to maintenance, right? If you intercept that and go, I'm going to actually go to maintenance for a while, side note, you can like physically feel a lot better, hunger, cravings, energy, training performance, recovery, mood, sleep, libido, stress, hormone function, digestive function, brain fog. I could go on for days. The things that start to feel better when you go to maintenance is unreal. But you also get to succeed your way to maintenance. Like I said before, your physical result is going to be the same in both of these scenarios. But in one scenario, you're failing your way there, which is probably what's happening right now if you can relate to all of this. If you actually decide to go to maintenance, you're then still going to maintain and get that same physical result you're getting right now. But because you've decided to do that and you're intentionally doing it, you are now succeeding your way there. Think about a person who is going through diet fatigue and mental fatigue, feeling like a failure every day. When they shift to feeling like I'm succeeding every day, tell me that does not start to relieve some of that mental pressure. I'm pausing so you can tell me. So I think that one, like I said, is going to be a lot of people it doesn't relate to, and it probably didn't hit you too much. If it did hit you, or you're like, oh shit, that is me, you might have to sit with it for a while. You might just have to, it can be like a little bit of a hard pill to swallow, but you do want to acknowledge it. You do want to accept it. And as savage as I probably just sounded for the last 20 minutes, I'm always savage with love because I would rather bring this shit to the surface. No one else is bringing this shit to the surface. Everyone right now is like, join my lock-in, join my 8-week challenge. F off with your lock-in, F off with your 8-week challenge. Let's talk to people about what they're actually going through. If you are actually going through this right now, I'm going to bring it forward. And you might hate me for a minute. You might be like, shut up, Rubes, you bloody just hit me in the feels. But if we can hit you in the feels, we can start to bring awareness and actually own and acknowledge what we are really going through. We do not need another 8-week challenge. We do not need to, quote, lock in. We need to acknowledge what is constantly friggin' derailing us and bring awareness to that, accept that, own that, and intercept it and go, I'm going to do shit differently so I can start to move past this. So again, she's gone savage for a minute, but like I said, I am savage with love because I want people to go, yeah, shit, no one has ever pointed that out to me. And as much as it was hard to hear at times, I'm actually glad I did hear it because now I can do something about it. And this is a really common thing. And if you think I'm talking about you right now, this is a funny thing where people are like, oh my God, she's talking about me. I'm not talking about one particular person. I'm talking about a lot of people. That's why I'm bringing it forward. This is such a common thing I see in consults where people come to me and they're like, I get it, but I'm kind of spinning my wheels and I'm this and I'm that. And this is where we sit down and we map out like, let's go to maintenance at this time. Let's have diet breaks at this time. Let's focus on the deficit at this time. And when you actually have that structured plan that does pull you out of the deficit at times to relieve a lot of this shit, we can then, quote, lock in, if you will, like everyone's friggin' doing at the moment or claiming they're doing. Funny how the same people that are locking in this month were locking in last month and the month before in January and whatever, but that's a story for a different day. But if you have an actual mapped out plan that has been constructed for you to really schedule different things at different times, you don't feel like you're just spinning your wheels trying to do the same thing all the time, especially if it's not working. So obviously I went hard on that one, but that is by far one of the most common things I see. And it's one of the most common things that people don't either don't understand or don't want to accept. And it makes sense that we don't, because a lot of people in these positions are like, I just want to freaking get to my goal. Yes, that can be true. But if it's true that you're just not getting there right now, we've got to do something about that. So if you can relate to that one, there's obviously a lot to think about there. You might have to listen to that again and feel like you got attacked again to let it sink in. But again, I think you kind of know if it's you or it's not and like how much you need to think into that one. The last point that I want to bring forward here, and we're actually going to like segue into this more in tomorrow's episode with a special guest. But the last point I want to look at here is if you feel like you've been trying to pursue fat loss and weight loss for a long time, and if you think about those initial points of like, yes, I understand flexible dieting, like, no, there's nothing major happening in my life that should be derailing this, but you just have such a strong history of like trying, failing, and this is where it can, not always, not for everybody, but for some people it can be like segueing into like stress eating, emotional eating, binge eating, etc. I do not coach on those things at all. I'm not an expert on those things at all, hence why we've got the special guest episode tomorrow. But what I want to point out here, I've spoken about this on the podcast before, but I think it's worth mentioning again. If you feel like you understand nutrition, you understand fat loss, you are like, logically, I know how all this shit is achieved. But like I said before, emotionally, something is just not vibing. It's not clicking. It's not working, right? If that's been a really continuous thing for you, the issue that I see here, and I say this with so much love, I promise I'm not going to go savage on this one because, like I said, this is not what I do. I can't speak to a binge eater or an emotional eater because I've not studied that field. I've not personally experienced that. So I can't connect with a person who's going through that. So I would never judge. I would never shame that, right? But the problem that I see here is people in this position continuously joining challenges or hiring nutritionists or joining gyms or programs thinking that that's going to solve your problem. And what I really want to point out here and what we really want to look at here is if you understand fat loss, if you understand calories enough, like you don't have to be an expert, but if you're in that position where you're like, yeah, I get that. Like I get nutrition enough. I should be able to do this, but for some reason I can't. That's what we really want to look at and go, you do not need to hire another nutritionist. You do not need to purchase another diet or program. You need to look at your psychology or your mental health or whatever it is for you personally that's stopping you from implementing those things. And again, I say that with love, but what I'm really trying to point out here is you do not have a lack of nutrition education. So it doesn't make sense to try and seek further nutrition education. And this is where I see so many people go wrong. They're like, oh, I just need to find the right program, the right coach, the right challenge. Nutrition isn't your problem. Training isn't your problem. You're struggling, like you might be struggling to stick to those things, but it's nothing to do with those things. And this can be one that a lot of people haven't connected the dots on. And again, this is where people can kind of shame themselves and be like, why can't I stick to this? Why can't I do this? But if we really, really look at this, if you're continuously, like I said, hiring nutritionists or joining programs or hiring coaches that are going to give you more nutrition facts, more recipes, more food guides, more shopping lists, all these things, if you really strip this shit back, you're like, no, I know what to buy at the supermarket. I've got enough recipes. I've bought every friggin' ebook under the sun, but I cannot stick to them. You really have to clock that and go, okay, so does it make sense to join something or hire someone that's going to give me more of those things? Or do I need to step away and look at, like I said, maybe it's counseling, maybe it's psychology, maybe it's mindset work, habit work. Like I said before, for some people, this can be more like self-sabotage, emotion things. There can be a lot going on there. But a nutritionist, if I think about myself, I've studied sports nutrition. I've studied the consumption, digestion, and absorption of food. I can tell you what happens to food when it hits your GI tract. I can't tell you why you can't stop eating Nutella out of the jar, right? And like I said before, I haven't studied that. I can't personally relate to that. And the problem that we can see here when people then do hire someone like me to solve this is, like I said, I don't have the skill set. I don't have the knowledge. So that's a really hard position for me to be in. And as the client who has paid and joined and got excited that you're going to get this thing sorted, if you've paid and joined and invested in someone that can't help you, that's obviously really shitty for you as well. You're like, I'm finally going to get help with this thing. You've got to make sure you're actually seeking out the help that you need. And so really that's the point I want to get across here. We've been through all of those other categories. If you can't really relate to those, if you feel like it's more of an emotional thing, stress thing, maybe self-sabotage, maybe binge eating, they're all a little bit different, but they might cross over. You might have a few of those things going on. Again, I'm not going to diagnose because this is not what I do. But if you hear all this and think, yeah, the facts make sense and that's all well and good, but for some effing reason, I just can't implement those. That is where your work is. That is the thing you want to do. And like I said, I send nothing but love and support. I know of, like I said, tomorrow's guest is a really good one, but I know of a lot of coaches or counselors or things that specialize in this. And like I said, they're not really handing out recipes. They're not giving shopping lists. They might give you that as well, but they're really looking at what is happening with the mindsets, the habits, etc., that's causing this for you. So I think the biggest takeaway on this one is if you feel like you've joined a lot of things and you've been taught a few different ways and a few different approaches, sometimes you just have to trial a few things to find the right fit for you. But if you feel like, again, I think if you know, you know, if you feel like you've joined a lot of things, you signed up to a lot of things, and you understand the facts enough, and you've got enough of the resources and recipes and stuff, you want to clock that and go, do I need to join another thing that's going to give me more facts, more resources, more recipes? Side note, in my opinion, no, you do not. Or do I need to look at the other side of this, the habit, the mindset, etc.? So obviously that was a big juicy episode, and different things are going to apply to different people. I think you might even have to listen again and have a little sift through and think, yeah, maybe none of these apply to you. Like I said, maybe you've had a really successful fat loss phase, which is awesome. We're going to talk a little bit more to you next week. But if any of these do apply to you, it's just important to kind of clock it and go, okay, cool. Is this a temporary little thing that I just need to adjust for and I can come back to my fat loss at another point? Is it more that I do need to embrace a bit more flexibility and enjoyment, etc.? Am I being a little bit too restrictive, too many rules? Or is it the diet fatigue? Have I been trying to do this for too long? Do I actually just need to give myself a bit of a break and set some different goals, set some different plans, take the pressure off and revisit fat loss at a later date? Or is there something else going on here that's not so much nutrition related? Yes, I wish I could manage my nutrition better, but there's clearly some other work that I've got to do to be able to then manage my nutrition better. Lots to think about, lots to consider. And like I said, sometimes it might be a little bit of hard truths, but it is really cool to just have the awareness of these things and start to think which ones might apply to you. And then if they do, what your best course of action is from there. And like I said, if you can relate to that final one, we do have our guest episode tomorrow, because this is not what I do at all. This is outside of my scope. This is outside of my wheelhouse. So I always like to bring in people who can cover these things more than I can. And then it's cool as well, because if you hear guests on episodes like that and you're like, oh my God, yes, this person understands me, you can reach out to that guest, you can get the support and everything that you're looking for. If it's more of a nutrition thing and you're just like, yeah, I need Rubes to help me map out a plan, obviously you can book in where you can do that. If you just need to give yourself a break, give yourself a break. If you need some more flexibility, follow Eat Like Ruby. Have the Eat Like Ruby bowl every day, put Nutella on everything. Probably not everything if you've got a fat loss goal, but really have a think about what you need to take from this episode, guys. We'll be back with the guests tomorrow and a few more solos in the coming days and weeks. And like I said, we're going to look at next week, moving away from fat loss, moving to maintenance, moving away from tracking food, etc. She's got plenty more to say. I've said enough for today. I will be back very soon. Thank you so much. The Eat Like Ruby podcast is not a substitute for professional medical or dietary advice. The advice given in this episode is general in nature and should not be used to treat any medical conditions, health conditions, illnesses, injuries, and/or any nutrition-related conditions, deficiencies, or similar. This podcast is not to be used as or in place of medical advice or dietary advice. Please consult your healthcare professional before implementing any of the advice, information, or protocols discussed in this episode.